Hello and welcome back to Reading Through Mark. We are just going into the Gospel of Mark and talking about what comes up as we get to know Jesus through the perspective of the writer of the Gospel of Mark. Today we are in Mark chapter 8, so let's go ahead and begin right there. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "7," they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. We'll go ahead and pause right there for a moment. We'll get into the next section in just a second here. But first off, we have this amazing miracle from Jesus. In this sin-corrupted world, there so often is not enough resources to go around, and yet Jesus, through his miracles, even fixes this problem here. Now, notice a couple fascinating points that happen in this miracle. First off, Jesus points out there's this huge lack. There's not enough food for the people. But the first thing they do is look at how many loaves they have. Right? So first off, Jesus makes the disciples aware that they have this big problem. And the first thing Jesus directs them to is to look toward the resources that God has already given them. How many loaves do you have? I think there's some interesting lessons for us as we think about just trying to survive in the world right now, right? Sometimes we don't have enough resources to make things work. We run out of money before we run out of month. But the first thing God directs us to in this case is to figure out what are the resources that we actually have, right? Are we being faithful with what God has given us? Are we making the most of the resources that God has allowed to us? Or are we being lazy with those things? Are we being irresponsible with those things? However, in this case, it does come through that, yes, they don't have enough. They are lacking. And yet, in this case, even when they find they don't have enough, what does Jesus do with the food? He thanks God for what he does have. Once again, I think there's a really cool lesson for us that even when we are being faithful with the resources that God has allowed us, it's good for us, even when those resources aren't enough, for us to learn to be thankful for what we do have, to learn that life of gratitude. If you're constantly looking, it's kind of that classic, half full or half empty kind of a situation, right? If I'm constantly just focusing on how I don't have enough, I'm going to be a lot more anxious, a lot more distressed. But if I can learn to be grateful for what I do have, that's just a much more wise way to live. You're going to find a lot more joy and thankfulness in that kind of a life. But then here, we find that even when there is not enough, we Christians can continue to trust our God to provide what we need, even when it seems like we don't have enough, even in this case when they literally did not have enough, right? One of the things Jesus teaches us to pray in the Lord's Prayer is, give us today our daily bread. And that not only is a command for us to pray in that way, that God would provide those things that we need daily for body and life, but it's also a promise from God. God teaches us to pray this way because he wants to do these very things for us. It's a promise that God will provide for us the things that we need every single day. And as we grow in faith, we grow to trust God even through the hardships of life, even those times of lack. Now, immediately following this amazing miracle of God, we get this fascinating commentary on this miracle. So let's take a look at that. We stopped at verse 11. So we're at Mark chapter 8, verse 11. There it says, "The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, 'Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it.' Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf, because one loaf they had with them in the boat. 'Be careful,' Jesus warned them. 'Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod.' They discussed this with one another and said, 'It is because we have no bread.' Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, 'Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? One last lesson from the feeding of the 5,000 as well as the 4,000 that I forgot to mention is they picked up the leftovers, right? That's another encouragement for us too as we think about the resources that God gives to us. Are we making use of all that we have, even those leftovers after we're done, right? Things that we can save later, things that we can be wise with in the future, right? There's some good encouragement for us to think about not being wasteful, right? But notice here, we have 2 people that just don't get it. Okay, first we have the Pharisees, and then we have the disciples. Notice the difference here, right? The Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask for a sign. Now, had Jesus given them signs in the past? Absolutely. We've seen tons of miracles from Jesus, and yet these guys come right back to Jesus saying, give me more proof. You haven't given me enough proof yet, right? And there's an indication here for us that there is something that is, there is a healthy skepticism, but at a certain point, skepticism becomes outright denial. Okay. In fact, in Romans, the Apostle Paul explains that unbelief is not a lack of knowledge; it is suppression of the truth. There does come a certain point where you have enough evidence to believe something, to change your mind about what the truth is, but you just simply refuse because you don't want to believe it. There's a pretty funny episode of Scooby-Doo where this kind of thing happens. Scooby-Doo, right? They always have this bad guy that's dressed up as a ghost or something like that, but turns out, yeah, you take the mask off, it was all perfectly explainable with logic and reason. But then they made a movie where Scooby-Doo actually runs into real zombies, and the entire movie, Fred is in absolute denial. It must be holograms, it must be this or that, right? At a certain point, yeah, you're just denying reality. And this is what Jesus' enemies are doing, the Pharisees, right? They are just denying reality. They cannot acknowledge what the truth is. And so Jesus tells his disciples, yeah, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. Watch out for this false teaching. And he uses that picture of yeast because if you're a baker or anything like that, you know you don't need very much yeast. You just put a little dab in there, a little bit in there, and it spreads all the way through the dough. In the same way, if I hold on to just a little bit of false teaching, a little bit of lies, right? That lie can very quickly spread through my entire beliefs, everything that I think about, right? And so this is an encouragement for us to make sure that we are pursuing truth at every level, in every situation, right? We don't want to be holding on to these lies. Now compare Jesus' response to the Pharisees who want nothing to do with Jesus. They are not actually interested in truth. Compare that with the disciples. The disciples also don't get it, right? They're maybe kind of dumb in some ways. And we do see that throughout the Gospels. The disciples can't figure out that, oh, Jesus just fed all these thousands of people with just a few little bits of bread, but here we are, we're going to starve because we only have 1 loaf of bread, right? How did they not get it, right? And the reality is, none of God's people fully get it, right? All of us still have a lot that we need to learn, right? A long way to grow in our faith and our understanding, right? And so this is where the disciples are. They too don't quite get it, but Jesus has a relationship with them. These people are, yes, they're dumb, but they're not pushing God away. They're not suppressing the truth. They are coming back to Jesus, looking for more information. And so the question is, who are you going to be? Right? When you don't understand what God is doing in your life, are you the kind of person that just shuts God out and says, nope, never mind, I don't want to listen to you, right? God, keep giving me proof despite the proof that you've given in the past? Or are you saying, yeah, I don't get it. God, teach me more, right? There's a humility that needs to come into us. There was an old saying back when I went to the seminary that it was said that those who come to the seminary are convinced they have everything figured out, that they know everything. By their second year, they've learned that there's a few things that they did not know. And by the time they graduate, they're convinced they know nothing at all. And the reality is, the more you learn, the more you realize just how much you don't know, right? And so again, this is something for us to learn some humility in our own lives, that we don't have all the answers. We don't fully understand this God whose ways are so far above our ways. And so we want to learn to have that humility, that we keep coming back to God, so that he might teach us, he might help us to gain understanding. That is all for now. God's richest blessings on you until we meet again.
And I say, can't be that easy. And he said, and no, it wasn't easy, but be still